To welcome all of you here on behalf of the UT Austin College of Education to this webinar, Beyond the Tipping Point, the Rise of Uncertified Teachers. This webinar is going to be recorded, and everyone will receive a copy of the recording as well as the Beyond the Tipping Point report by tomorrow at the latest. So again, a bit of housekeeping before I turn the agenda over to Dean Martinez. We have a Q&A button, which you should all be able to see at the bottom of your screen. And we would love to invite you to use that to post your questions about the research findings at any time during or after Dr. Laura Torres's presentation, which is coming up here. We'll set aside 15 minutes to verbally answer questions, and our lead researchers will also try to answer questions in writing as time permits. In addition to the recommendations in the report, which you're going to hear about in just a moment, we know that there's a ton of wisdom on the webinar and in this room. So we are also going to be dropping a link into the chat in just a moment, which is a quick survey form where we would love to hear your feedback on what you think are the action steps that we should collectively be taking as we think about this rise of uncertified teachers. So the agenda for today's webinar, and my colleague Jacob is trying to get our slides up, but I'm going to just walk you through it. As I said, our Dean of the College of Education here at UT Austin, Charles Martinez, who's with me on screen, is going to frame for us what's at stake and talk us through a little bit, set the stage for why we're doing this webinar now and why we came out with the report. And then Dr. Laura Torres is going to present the Beyond the Tipping Point findings and recommendations. She'll be joined by, thank you, Jacob, if you could just flip through to slide 3, which has the agenda. She'll be joined by our lead researcher, Dr. Michael Martyr, to take your questions on the findings for about 15 minutes, as I mentioned. And this will be facilitated by another of our colleagues here at the College of Education, our Senior Associate Dean, Beth Malik. And we'll be looking for themes in the questions that you submit using that button to maximize our time. I am very excited to have that followed by a conversation with our panelists, Dr. Michelle Reinhardt of Alpine ISD, Charles Glover from the Meadows Foundation, and Dan Huberty, former State Representative Dan Huberty of Moat Casey, will be joining me for a conversation to share their reflections and reactions to the report. And then we'll have Dean Martinez summarize our time together and share a bit more about our planned next steps before we let you go. And so with that, Jacob, we can stop sharing the slides, and I am so happy to turn it over to Dean Martinez to kick us off with the framing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Well, welcome everybody. It's great having you all here as attendees for this really important conversation. My name is Dr. Charles Martinez. I'm Dean of the College of Education here at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you for spending time during your lunch hour with us on this important topic around the rise of uncertified teachers in Texas. Many of you likely joined us in person or via live stream for our teacher tipping point convening back in 2022, or read our original study on educator preparation pathways and the difference in student outcomes and teacher retention that we found between university certified and alternatively certified teachers in Texas. That a lot has changed in just a short amount of time since 2022, when that first teacher tipping point report was submitted to Texas. And this supplemental report we're releasing today, Beyond the Tipping Point, the Rise of Uncertified Teachers, is really an extension of that first study. In the 2 years since the teacher tipping point convening, a new and troubling trend has emerged in the data when it comes to new teachers who are uncertified in Texas. In fact, that trend changed in an astonishing way 2 years ago. So if you look at it historically, we saw growth in uncertified teachers over an extended period of time, but that growth curve was relatively modest and linear. What happened 2 years ago is we experienced a dramatic shift, unlike anything we typically ever see in longitudinal data. We can describe the shift, and that's part of the report, but we thought it was most important to get under the hood around that shift to understand what are the drivers of that shift. What does it look like in terms of teacher retention and student outcomes? And then how is it being experienced by school leaders? So this study is both qualitative and quantitative, and it hopefully will be instrumental as we think about the way forward for Texas. For us here at UT Austin, as a world-class research institution, we really have a responsibility to shine a bright light on what the data can tell us about a problem as thorny and complex as this one is, so that we can equip policymakers with what they need to act. When Texas needs us, it really is a responsibility of a state flagship like UT Austin to heed the call. And that really underneath this is the driver and motivation. Our job when we're at our best here in universities is to sort of amplify the knowledge base, the data, what they tell us, so that policymakers and school leaders can make the most informed decisions. Today, you're going to hear a presentation about our key findings and recommendations. You have the opportunity to ask some questions of our lead researchers and hear a panel discussion from experts in the field who have diverse perspectives on the issues and what we should do about it. As you will hear, Beyond the Tipping Point use two sources of data. The first are longitudinal student level data, quantitative research led by Dr. Michael Martyr, who will be with us today, where we sought to understand where and what are uncertified teachers teaching and what are the impacts on teacher retention and student achievement. Secondly, the data sources here come from interviews with school district leaders, qualitative research led by our own Dr. Laura Torres, where we wanted to better understand and learn the phenomenological experiences of what it was like for school leaders in this unprecedented time, how districts are hiring and supporting uncertified teachers, and what are their major needs and challenges in this current landscape. When I'm asked about this problem in Texas, I've been in Texas now for more than 6 years. I often describe what's going on in Texas as sort of uniquely Texan. And what I mean by that is the complexity demographically of the state, its size, its reach, become really important in understanding this problem. We have faced a crisis as it relates to the teacher preparation pipeline for longer than a decade. This is a national problem, but it is taken root in Texas in very particular ways. Maybe, like I said, uniquely Texas. We historically will lose in the ballpark of 8 to 10% of the workforce on any given year in Texas. Those are very high attrition rates. And we know that this has been exacerbated dramatically by the pandemic, where the year-over-year attrition of teachers has spiked in the near 13%. And when you think about that, it may not sound like a big number, but it's a gigantic number when you think about the size of Texas. We're talking about the attrition of 40,000 or more teachers on the most challenging years we've experienced since the pandemic. And when you look at a problem of 40,000 teachers, you instantly realize that no high quality teacher preparation program alone can solve that problem. Certainly not one institution, and even the collection of high quality educator preparation programs on their own are unlikely to stem an exodus at that magnitude without a much more nuanced approach. It's not surprising then that alternative certification pathways have entered this to fill the gap. Our first study really focused on this and what does it mean in terms of outcomes for students and for teachers in terms of their attrition, depending on those certification pathways. And it turns out it does matter. And it's not just, alternative certification versus institutions of higher ed. There's subtleties in those data, and we know that there's high quality alternative certification in Texas and elsewhere that also supports teacher retention and strong outcomes for students. So it's not just a conversation about alternative certification and teacher preparation programs. And now we're facing an entirely different set of circumstances because it's no longer what type of certification. It's really now a question of, does certification matter, and what's at stake for the future of Texas. So this is really the moment where this study like this becomes really important as we think about the work in the last legislative session around the educator workforce and a lot of strong bipartisan policy support for what can be done. Now we're facing a much more urgent and challenging dilemma around the rise of uncertified teachers as we're about to enter the next legislative session. So it is really an important topic. I want to also just recognize that those of you attending this webinar have unique wisdom to bring to this issue. And as Tara alluded to, we're going to invite you to share your action reflections via a survey as you hear the report. So you're going to see some links. It'll be there more than once in the chat for you to click and just offer some action reflection. And I would suggest, questions are for the chat. This link is really for the experts in this audience to think about, what do the data sing to you? What do they tell you? What are some actions that maybe we need to put on the table to address this issue, given the expertise that we have in this room? So we see it as precious, your time. If you're watching this after this live webinar, please send along those recommendations and ideas, because this is just a critical time that we bring all of Texas's talent to address this urgent topic on behalf of the future of young Texas, young Texans, and our entire state. In the audience today, we have public school administrators, education advocates, teacher preparation program leaders, funders, and representatives from legislature and state agencies. So we are very excited to have your feedback as you click on those feedback links. Now it is my great pleasure to turn the microphone over to Dr. Laura Torres, who is our Director of Data Analytics, Assessment, and Translational Research here in the College of Education. I will say Laura's, in addition to being directly involved in the qualitative aspects of this study, also has really played a prominent role in our college and with some of our service to the state initiatives, like with our Research Practice Policy Network, our RP3 network, in helping our faculty do translational work on research findings that really can impact policymakers and decision makers on the ground. So it's great having her here on behalf of the scholars who conducted this research to present the main findings. As a reminder, you can use the Q&A button at any time to raise a question for our researchers. We'll have 15 minutes at the end of Laura's presentation to address your questions. My suggestion for this phase is your questions here are more focused on what the data tell us, and it might be about the methodology or how we approached the problems. The questions of what does it mean, we'll save to the next section here as we hear from panelists and we begin to talk together about what does this mean and what do we do about it for Texas. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat around the presentation. With that, I will turn things over to Dr. Torres.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up. Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure. You could see my slides if you can't see anything. But yes, I'm very grateful to be able to share these emerging findings with all of you. And we're also very grateful to the experts who made this work possible, including our research team, faculty and staff here at UT Austin, but also outside of UT, especially all of the district leaders and administrators that we've interviewed across the state. We just really appreciate your time, your words of wisdom, and we look forward to continue learning from all of you. As Dean Martinez said, this is an extension of a prior study we did back in 2022. We also presented those findings. I'll give you just a quick kind of refresher on those findings. So overall, the research showed that, when we were comparing university certified teachers to those from alternative certification pathways, university certified teachers had better student achievement outcomes in terms of months of student learning. We also found that university certified teachers stayed longer in the field, longer in the classroom compared to those from alternative routes, looking over a 9-year period. And then we also saw that, there were fewer teachers coming from Texas universities, especially here. This is for middle school and high school. And really, Dr. Martyr projected that to continue to decline over time as alternative certified teachers would continue to increase, or the majority of teachers would be coming from alternative routes. And now that narrative has shifted to the majority of newly hired teachers are now without a certification at all. So that was our first key finding in the study that we have conducted. Over half of newly hired teachers are now without a certification. So this is showing just snapshots over time. And you could see that in 2013-14 snapshot, the majority of our newly hired teachers were coming from standard university routes at 44%. And then in 2018-19, you could see that the majority were coming from alternative certification routes at 36%. And now this is where we are today, of over 50% are coming from, or actually have no certification at all. It's important to note that we are excluding re-entering teachers in our analysis. This is something that Dr. Martyr really wanted me to point out, is that we are excluding teachers who have been certified, were in the classroom, maybe they took some time off and are re-entering the field. And so these teachers are not being counted as new teachers. So overall, this is showing how drastically the incoming teacher workforce has changed over time. So many of you are probably wondering, how did we get here? So this is just showing just kind of a roadmap of kind of big points in time that may have led us to where we are now, with alternative certification programs beginning in the 1980s. There were several policy and programmatic changes that happened along the way, but the primary factors seem to be the start of the Districts of Innovation plans in 2015, which allowed regular districts to hire teachers without certification for cases when they could not acquire certified teachers. So in those emergency situations. And then in the wake of the pandemic, as you all know, we saw a big surge of experienced teachers resigning or retiring from the field. And so that's led us to where we are today. However, with the decade-long decline in university certified teachers that you saw from our previous study that I showed you, this trend was in the making, before the pandemic. And so this has really left many districts, district leaders in emergency situations where they've really had no other choice but to hire teachers without a teaching certification to fill their classrooms. In our interviews with district leaders and administrators, their number one priority is to put quality teachers in their classrooms. That is what they're trying to do. But in many cases, they're left without a choice because there's just not enough certified teachers. And Dean Martinez also gave you an overview of the two primary sources from this current study. So I'll just kind of remind you again, this is using Texas Education Research Center longitudinal student and teacher level data. Sorry, there's a typo in there. And also district interviews. So this is something different that we've added compared to the study, the teacher tipping point study we did a few years ago, in that we've added a qualitative component here where we've actually been asking districts, leaders and administrators what their experiences have been in their districts. And I'll share that with you today. Just a quick overview of how we're defining a new teacher. So these teachers are teachers hired for the first time as a teacher of record in Texas. And again, it's excluding the former teachers who re-enter the field. Uncertified teachers are those without any teaching certification. University certified teachers are those prepared from Texas universities, Texas EPPs, and went through a student teaching component before they became a teacher of record, versus alternative certified teachers are those who were prepared in an EPP that did not include a student teaching component before they became a teacher of record. In key finding 2, so what we were looking at is where uncertified teachers were teaching, and we found that a higher proportion are in secondary STEM, CTE, elementary school contexts, especially within rural and small town areas. So this figure here is showing the proportion of newly hired full-time equivalent uncertified teachers by locale. As you can see, the percentage of newly hired teachers who were uncertified is higher in the small town rural areas compared to those in suburban and urban districts. This trend is seen across all school contexts and discipline areas, which I'll show some examples. These are percentages of new teachers and not the percentage of the overall teaching workforce, just so you know, that's an important note here. These are newly hired first-time teachers. Many of the increases in newly hired uncertified teachers are happening more recently. So in the last couple of years, really. So here in this example of secondary career and technical education, the percentage of newly hired uncertified teachers over doubled in size from 2022 to 23 in both suburban and urban districts. In terms of secondary STEM, the percentage of newly hired uncertified teachers over doubled in size as well in small town rural districts from 30% in 2019 to now 69% in 2023. This is concerning, especially if our state is to lead the way in the STEM workforce industries. You know, we need to make sure that our teachers are well prepared, well trained, our students are being prepared to enter into these careers. In elementary, the percentage of newly hired uncertified teachers tripled in size from 10% in 2022 to 31% in 2023 in elementary suburban districts. And then some surprising also findings is that in pre-K as well, you know, we all know how important it is in the early careers for a child's development. So this is particularly concerning that we're needing to hire teachers with little to no educational preparation in pre-K classrooms. And then in addition to special ed, we're also seeing, despite, you know, the state's requirement that special ed teachers must have completed a qualifying teacher education program, we are seeing uncertified teachers in these fields. And so this is a question that we want to dig in for future research. We definitely need to learn more about the stories behind these numbers. For key finding 3, so we did find, Dr. Martyr found that student achievement is lower when they have teachers who are uncertified compared to those who are certified and have classroom experience. So here, you know, students lost up to 6 months of learning in high school English and nearly 4 months of learning in high school math when they had teachers without certification compared to those from standard university routes. So what this is showing is, you know, we're using the baseline here, standard university certified teachers as the baseline. Somebody trying to get to me. I'm seeing something in the chat. Just holler if you're trying to tell me something. Sorry, I keep seeing something pop up on my screen. So almost all of these findings had statistical significance. These findings are in alignment with recent research from Dr. Jacob Kirksey at Texas Tech and Circle, and also Dr. Jim Oversheld at Texas State relating to learning loss when students had uncertified teachers with no classroom experience. Also to note, this includes data prior to the COVID-19. You know, future research or more research is needed to understand what this looks like now. So I just want to make note of that. In key finding 4, we are finding that routes do indeed matter when it comes to teacher retention. So across different pathways, we are finding that, or Dr. Martyr found that over a 5-year period, what percentage were still in the classroom? Well, he found that of those who were not certified, less than 40% were still in the classroom, with 30% dropping off after their first year, compared to teachers from all other routes. So this includes intern or alternative certified teachers, and also compared to standard university teachers. So overall, this is saying that there's even more of a risk around putting uncertified teachers in the classroom, even compared to those from alternative certification routes. You know, it echoes our prior research as well. And in key finding 5, so this is our last kind of big takeaway finding. And this is looking at the results from our qualitative interviews with district leaders. We have interviewed over 20 district leaders and administrators from across the state of, varying sizes, rural, urban districts. And overall, the overall themes that we're seeing when we're asking them, what are the major challenges you're seeing? What are your needs? They're saying that we really need to figure out a way to help get more teachers certified and prepared before they enter the classroom. Also, providing more school support to tackle the teacher shortage. So these were the overall themes that emerged when we asked the question, what major challenges, if any, is your district facing with the hiring of uncertified teachers? So right off the bat, this is almost 80% of them are saying, a lot of the uncertified teachers are really struggling with behavior and classroom management skills. So these are basic skills that a teacher really needs to know how to do before they enter a classroom. And the schools themselves are the ones that they have to figure out how to train their uncertified teachers to give them that support that they need. And so often this happens with hiring existing teachers to act as mentors. Many of the districts do have, or all of them really do have, support structures in place, but they're realizing that they're having to provide more differentiated support and more support for the uncertified teachers versus those who come in certified. Adjusting to educator and campus culture was another one that emerged. About 65% of them were saying things around, just basic professionalism, vernacular, juggling, all of the other responsibilities a teacher has outside of the classroom, like paperwork and communicating with parents and collaborating with other teachers, organization. So things like that is a lot of our uncertified teachers are having a hard time juggling those responsibilities, and it comes at a shock really to them. And then third, they end up leaving. So teacher retention was also an issue that many are facing that challenge. As you saw, many of them drop off after their first year. It wasn't uncommon to hear stories of the uncertified teachers leaving after the first day of class because they realized, whoa, this is something that I can't take on. And then lastly, completing the certification requirement. So a lot of our districts are implementing their own requirements in which uncertified teachers must get certified within a certain period of time. This is not an overall state requirement. They're just, establishing these themselves. Many of them are giving a timeline of at least 1 to 3 years. And if the teacher does not get certified within that time frame, they do not continue. And so they're just sharing that many of them have a hard time juggling both getting through the certification process and also being a full-time teacher. And then I provided some sample quotes, just some selected quotes, just to give you a little more context behind these themes. There's one person saying that, yes, the classroom management and the pedagogical skills, and these are basic skills that a teacher really needs to know before entering the classroom. This is an example of, many times in this district in particular, when hiring industry professionals to teach like the CTE courses, they're often used to working with a certain group of people like technical college students or adult customers. And so when they get in a classroom of 20 teenagers, high schoolers, that's a lot different. And so adjusting to that way of teaching can be a challenge. Teacher retention. So many of them, as I said, they really become overwhelmed with the amount of work it takes to juggle being a full-time teacher and completing their certification requirements, and they simply just leave the classroom. And then also around completing the certification requirement. So in many areas, especially in special ed and bilingual, teachers have to take, several exams, many of which are costly. And if they don't pass them, they have to retake them. And some of them just decide, this isn't worth it for me, the time and the cost it takes to finish. And so they end up not completing their certification. And so with all of this, both the quantitative and the qualitative research and from voices across the field, we have come up with 3 key recommendations. One around directing resources to teacher candidates in high quality educator preparation programs. investing in high quality educator preparation pathways, and also supporting and retaining high quality teachers. And to go into a little more detail here in the first, for example, in the first recommendation, some of these things could look like increasing scholarships and loan forgiveness, waiving tuition and fees for students during their student teaching semester, and creating new and innovative pathways to get them through the certification process. Investing in high-performing EPPs, so ensuring that we are directing resources to those EPPs that have been shown to produce well-prepared teachers, and streamlining the certification process to make it more efficient. And then lastly, supporting and retaining our high-quality teachers. This could be through expanding TIA allotment and other compensation resources, especially for those who are certified, and also strengthening the capacity of school staff and leadership to create positive working environments, implement, early career mentoring and coaching programs, and delivering the ongoing support that all teachers need. Thank you. And that's all I have. Stop sharing my screen. Am I supposed to leave the next section? I think now it's Q&A with myself and Dr. Martyr.
We can go right to Beth here to kind of facilitate the Q&A. I see there are some questions backed up here. Beth, you might have been reviewing them along the way.
I have.
Dr. Beth Malik, our Senior Associate Dean here in the College of Education. Thanks, Dr. Malik.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today. I'm just going to facilitate some of these questions. Keep putting them into the Q&A. I'm trying to pull out a few themes here. So I'll start. There's some questions about uncertified teachers and thinking about that group of teachers. One person asks, can you disaggregate uncertified teachers to distinguish those who might be teaching while pursuing certification?
And there was also another question along the same lines, asking if someone is currently in an ACP, alternative certification program, that hasn't finished, are they considered uncertified or in the alternative certification group? So a little bit of commentary on how alternative certification frequently works.
And Dr. Martyr, before you answer, will you just introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I've looked at the participant list and I thought I knew an awful lot of the people there. It's great to see everybody. My name is Michael Martyr. I'm the executive director of UTeach at the University of Texas at Austin, also in the physics department. I've been directing secondary STEM teacher preparation at UT Austin since 1997, and that program has expanded to 54 universities across the United States and 12 in Texas. So I'm also overseeing, with a lot of help, about half the secondary STEM teachers coming from universities in the state of Texas. So a long period of learning about the details of how teacher preparation works, working with students, hearing the stories of how they turned out. And I did a lot of the work that was just discussed so wonderfully by Laura Torres. So back to the question of alternative certification. When people begin teaching under alternative certification, it's very common. By far the most common way is for them to enter teaching on what's called an intern certificate, which means they have a one-year certificate where they are teaching full-time, but they get extra support. They don't yet have a standard certificate that means they are free and done. They are engaged with the program and they are getting a lot of coaching and interaction during their first year while they learn to teach. They have a certificate for this. It's an intern certificate. They are not uncertified. So if someone is learning to teach in the framework of Texas Alternative Certification, They are not counted as uncertified here. They're in a well-established framework that the state has used for many years and that has its own track record and advantages and disadvantages. What's really new is having so many new teachers going into teaching without that support structure. I see
Okay.
some other questions that I'd be glad to respond to.
Yeah, there is one related to uncertified teachers. Mark Olafson asks about your analysis really pulled from pre-COVID, the learning loss in pre-COVID times, but the rapid rise in uncertified hires is COVID and after. So is there a challenge to generalizability because the uncertified population may now be different?
So that's a completely legitimate question. There have never been so many, and the schools have never been hiring so many under such pressure. And they could very well be different than they were before. But I challenge each of you to ask yourselves whether the nature of those differences makes you think that they are much likely to be better. And let me illustrate this by pointing out the two places where a certificate is most significant, because certificates are really impactful at two rather different points in a teacher's career, and you should be thinking about both of them. One of them is upon entry. Certificates require an extensive set of activities that have been developed over decades. They correspond to common sense, and they ensure that teachers have practiced what they will do before they begin doing it full time, and they have support as they begin doing it full time. So our record from the past showed that people who avoided that did not do as well and did not stay as long. You have to ask, now that the schools are filled with many more, do you really think the outcomes are going to be better? But that's just the first point where certificates are very significant. The second point comes when a teacher commits an ethical violation. The Educator Code of Ethics describes a wide range of activities a teacher can carry out short of literally breaking the law that mean that Texas does not regard them as suitable for teaching anymore. And this is not an idle matter. Every State Board of Educator certification meeting contains a middle section, which is fairly melancholy, in which teachers are stripped of their certificates. If having a certificate is no longer in practice needed in order to teach in the state of Texas, then the Educator Code of Ethics has lost its force. And there is no longer a mechanism for teachers who have not followed the ethical prescriptions of the state to have their jobs challenged. Again, we don't know the way that things will work out now that teachers without certificates have become the majority. But who amongst us could really think that moving from 10% of teachers not having to follow the code of ethics to 50% of the new ones not having to follow it could possibly be an improvement?
Thank you, Michael. There's a couple of clarification questions about the slides, and we often have this question on the slide comparing standard and traditionally certified teachers versus uncertified, where you talk about learning loss or the difference in the learning. Could you clarify that a little bit, what you mean by that?
Yes, so it's very challenging to measure what students learn. But the state has provided an incredible resource through the Education Research Center, which has tabulated every test and every question that students have taken and linked them to teachers since 2012. So what we are able to do is to look at all the state mandated tests and the tested subjects and compare like with like. So find students in classrooms whose teacher came from one source and find similar students in another classroom where teachers came from another. And then having the enormous scale of Texas and the span of many years, do a comparison. And the results that we told you about come from having done that. So the largest single difference we found was in high school English, where students whose teacher was uncertified learned 6 months out of a 9-month academic year less than students whose teachers came from a traditional university program. It's a very large difference. Now, I don't want to dismiss Mark Olafson's point. It will take many years before we know for sure whether the new flood of uncertified teachers is producing those same results. But do we want to wait until we're sure? Because by the time we're sure, there will be so many such teachers in the school that it will be immeasurably harder to pull back. So I think it's appropriate to use the best evidence we have, which is, I think, what we have shown you. And I'll emphasize again that there are 3 separate groups that have found similar learning loss results. Jacob Kirksey at Texas Tech, Jim Van Overscheld at Texas State, and I found similar results here for uncertified teachers. We are all in agreement. We are finding similar results with our separate codes and approaches, and I think it's appropriate to give everybody a heads up on this.
Michael, did you find any evidence of uncertified teachers who did not hold a bachelor's degree?
Yes, I did. And I've been looking at that a little bit. I found overall that, if I recall, that 14% in the most recent data I had available of the uncertified teachers had no record of a bachelor's degree as well. At least the school did not record them as having one. And although the numbers in areas such as secondary STEM and liberal arts are still small, they are growing very, very rapidly. So if being uncertified was a growth area that exploded 2 years ago, we may be facing another growth area, which is an explosion of teachers who not only hold no certificate, but do not have an undergraduate degree. That's not so concerning for career and technical education, where there are specific procedures and policies that permit someone with career experience to come in and share it. That's not the concern that we're raising. The concern we are raising is high school math teachers, high school science teachers, elementary teachers, middle school teachers entering teaching without holding themselves a bachelor's degree. That it does appear to be growing very rapidly.
Thank you. And Laura, you did the interviews. We had a question about, someone just noted that those quotes that you provided were really powerful. And she wondered if any of the administrators had stories or insights from students or parents regarding their thoughts on uncertified teachers.
That's a good question. I think that's something that we would like to do in the future, is to actually interview, not only principals, superintendents, directors of HR, but also teachers themselves, so they can provide more of those stories, or parents, even students. We did hear some stories about a mix, really. Some students were saying, or had, comments about how helpful it was to have their uncertified teacher. And no doubt there are uncertified teachers out there that are very caring and have the passion for teaching. And some of them adjust fairly quickly to the requirements it takes, the responsibility to being a good teacher, and learn fairly quickly. But unfortunately, that's just not enough. Not enough of that is happening, really. Those are kind of few and far between, rare cases. But I think, there have been a mixed of students saying either, they love their teacher, whether or not they were certified or not. It was interesting to have a teacher that had this kind of on the ground experience. I think this must have been a CTE class. And then there's also, with, notifying parents about whether or not they have a certified teacher or not. Some districts are requiring that, some maybe are behind in that. So I didn't hear any stories from the parents, but from the students, it was mixed of positive experiences. Of course, some of them, ended up struggling to learn the material. And so other teachers had to kind of join in to help in the classroom of those that had uncertified teachers. So that's a very good question. And I think we do need to do more research in that area for that group.
Great, thank you. We have a bunch of questions coming in, and we have, I think, a couple of minutes left for the Q&A. I'll ask this question. Is there any data on the differences between public and private schools, certification differences or student achievement differences related to these different pathways?
That's a great question. And the answer is that I at least don't have any data on private schools. The state doesn't gather it. So just to be clear, charter schools are public schools. So the data do include charter schools, but true private schools, the state does not gather data and provide them. Perhaps, Laura, you conduct some interviews. That might be our only hope in that case.
Yeah. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. I'm handing this over to Tara Kirkland. I know that Dr. Torres and Dr. Martyr will continue working on these questions, at least the ones that they can respond to in writing on the Q&A, so you can see those there. And then a number of the questions that came up, I think might be discussed by our panelists in a few minutes. So I think we'll hit some of those themes here in our next section. So I'll turn it over to Tara.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Martyr, Dr. Torres, and Dr. Malik. And yes, I hope that as we go, and I am joined by my panelists here to go a little bit deeper, Laura and Michael will have a chance to address some of your questions that are still there in the Q&A thread. So thank you very much for submitting all of those questions. I'm excited to bring some additional voices and perspectives into the conversation now. So joining me on screen, we've got Dr. Michelle Reinhardt, Dan Huberty, and Charles Glover. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about each one of them before we dive in. So Dr. Reinhardt is joining us, superintendent from Alpine Independent School District way out there in West Texas, where I have some family. So very excited to have Michelle joining us. She's a rural education advocate who brings about 2.5 years there as superintendent at Alpine, where she serves over 1,000 students and 200 employees. So she's bringing that with her to this conversation, as well as previous work as an assistant superintendent, regional educational consultant, and classroom teacher in various West Texas school districts and service centers. So thank you for joining us today, Michelle. Also with us is Charles Glover, who's the Vice President of Grants for the Meadows Foundation, which is one of the largest private philanthropies in Texas. And there he leads and aligns all grant making within the foundation's strategic priorities. Charles was previously a senior fellow at Bellwether Education Partners and served as a cabinet member in Dallas ISD and came to Texas as the founding executive director for Teach for America's Dallas branch, and also brings his experience as a middle school teacher and football coach to the conversation. Thanks for joining us, Charles. And then last but certainly not least, Dan Huberty, former state representative, Republican of Humble, first joined Moat Casey, a consulting firm dedicated to advancing Texas schools, in 2022 as a board member, and has served as chief operating officer there since January of 2023. Dan is bringing 6 terms in the Texas House of Representatives and continuous service on the Committee on Public Education to us today. And Dan, I want to point out, was elected chairman during the 85th and 86th legislative sessions when he championed several important pieces of legislation, including transformational reforms to Texas public school finance. And you also bring your experience as a school board president for 5 years to us. So with that and a whole lot of educational and experience that's varied in your background, I welcome you. And we've got about 25 minutes together. I'd love for each of you to just take a couple minutes here at the front end. Anything you would like to say about your experience or by way of introduction that I did not mention, and what stands out to you thus far in the presentation, in the Q&A? What's kind of top of mind for you? And Michelle, may I start with you, please?
Sure, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. So really this research confirms what we're seeing locally here in Alpine and the mountains of West Texas, and shows kind of the statewide patterns that go along with this. And so currently of our 75 teachers across the district, 12 are uncertified. About a decade ago, that number would have been 0. We never would have been in a position to hire an uncertified teacher. And so really what we're seeing are the impacts of the larger context shifts within education and how they are impacting our teacher workforce now. And so, specifically, if we look at the last 10 years or so, you've seen an intentional defunding of public education, most pronounced specifically in many of our rural districts across the state. We'll unpack that a bit more later. That has resulted in significantly depressed teacher salaries. So when I started teaching in this region of West Texas in 2007, I was making the state minimum, $29,000 a year. That state minimum adjusted for inflation to today's to today in July 2024, actually is the most recent data, would have a state minimum teacher salary of $44,000. And yet our state minimum salary for teachers is $33,660. And many of our rural districts, Alpine included, are forced to pay state minimum salaries because of persistent underfunding. And so you're seeing, again, this kind of divestment, if you will, in teaching as a profession, where teachers' dollars, if you will, or salary dollars don't go as far now as they did even just 14 years ago. And then some of the other kind of statewide concerns we're seeing: state leaders vilifying public school educators have also led to this statewide teacher shortage, and really just in many ways seeing a void of state level leadership in support of public education. And so we have seen all of those things. We've been living them here in rural West Texas. And I think this report is incredibly important to draw attention to this statewide issue and really have us thinking about when is enough, and when will we as a state really address this issue in meaningful ways to make sure that public schools truly can hire both certified but also well-prepared teachers to help lead the children of Texas.
Thank you, Dr. Reinhardt. Charles, can I ask you to go next, sir?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. Also for the work. The UT School of Education has updated after the original tipping point. So I appreciate the conversation. Appreciate all the questions as well. So as mentioned, I'm at the Meadows Foundation, and we actually have one of 5 strategic initiatives, which is in educator preparation. And so our target there is that all certified teachers becoming new hires in Dallas and in the Rio Grande Valley, that's really defined as Region 1 and Region 10, are coming out of high quality educator preparation programs. When we set sail on that some years ago, the data that we're seeing today was not the data then. And so when we thought about our denominator was primarily made up of alternative certification and traditional certification pathways. And so I just, one of the things that really stands out to me, to answer your question, Tara, is the sociological significance of the data jump that we've seen in such a short period of time. Good, bad, or otherwise, it's significant. It's not something that I ever would have thought we would see in the time frame that we have. And to some of the previous speakers' points, what impact does that have, right, is the question. And we have some leading indicators, and we need to look at ultimately summative data over time. But when we set out to hit our target, we did not expect to be on track to hit our target, which we actually are, because it's very difficult to track the hires when they're not coming from educator preparation programs as well, and what that training may or may not be. And so when we thought of our lens of being alternative certification or traditional pathways, and now this uncertified lens being such a significant portion, and what that training could look like or not, because I think it's important to know that just because someone's uncertified does not mean that they may not be effective in the classroom. But the trend as a whole and the significant denominator that has now been created in that space and the leading indicators lead us to say, this needs to be a consideration, right? And so how are we shifting also the lens of just thinking, we thought about this as a supply problem. So if you think about supply and demand, the lens we thought about was supply, right? So we need more high quality EPPs. We need the existing high quality EPPs to grow and expand and be supported publicly and privately. But the demand part of the equation is another part of it, and that's who's actually making the hires. And so what does this data tell us about demand? And in the same way that an uncertified teacher doesn't mean that they necessarily would be ineffective, just because someone's certified does not inoculate them against being ineffective per se. But the data trends are significant. And that's what this data has shown us, both in the previous, when we were looking across a landscape that didn't actually have the level of anomaly that we see now in uncertified. And so those are all things that we want to take into consideration. Those are things that we want to take into consideration in our own investments and how we think about this. And I'd round that out by saying, that's why I actually think it's so important to think about what the student outcomes are associated with these different inputs, being uncertified, alternatively certified, traditionally certified. What is ultimately are those outcomes? I know that former Chairman Huberty may speak to a couple of those components as a big part of legislation that he helped lead when we think about things like that. But if we're not applying it to what we see as the strongest point for investment in a long-term return in a student's ultimate outcomes, being that classroom instructor. And that point, just like when we think about investing in the life cycle of a child, pre-K being so incredibly important, so formative. What do they say? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of remediation. If we get certification and preparation right, that's something that we know is providing longer term dividends. And that's a lot of the Dr. Martyr showed a lot of that data aligns to that as well.
Great. Thank you, Charles. Sociological significance. I noted that phrase. What would you add, sir, Mr. Huberty?
Thank you. I'm happy to be with you here today. Yeah, I'm gonna read something to you. It says, every future begins with a high quality education, which starts with having a high quality educator. That is from the background and purpose of House Bill 11 from last session that died in the Senate. You know, I've been around the process a very long time. And as Dr. Reinhardt pointed out, you know, the last funding increase the state of Texas has had has been since 2019 in the basic allotment. While there are some conversations that have had about increased funding, and we've seen some of that, the reality is, I mean, what I do for a living now is we just call balls and strikes. You know, we don't take a position one way or the other, just tell you what the facts of the matter are. The facts are is that we haven't had any increase in the basic allotment. And we've had inflation that's increased, and we had a small little, you know, worldwide pandemic, you know, that small little things that happen, and, you know, inflation's out of control. And so you have a situation of shortage of teachers for a variety of reasons. And I know in a briefing call, Tara, we talked about this, but I think it's important to have a little history of, you know, how did we get to where we're at, right? You know, starting in 2005, you know, the legislature placed a surcharge on the TRS contributions associated with teachers. And that was specifically related to this rehire situation, because it was creating a problem with the pension system. And so when a teacher would retire, we'd rehire them back right away, and they weren't paying into the system. And so we had to create a mechanism to be able to deal with that. Fast forward to, you know, early in the early 2010s, you know, additional provisions were put out that you had a kind of a one-year moratorium on being able to go back into the classroom. And part of it was because that they weren't creating these opportunities for new teachers to come in. Who had ever thought, you know, here's where we go. 2015, under House Bill 1842, you passed the District of Innovation. District of Innovation was a couple different things, but it was a remediation tool for districts that were in trouble being taken over through the A through F system that was recently put in place. But it also created an opportunity for districts to do that. And originally it was started with, a lot of it was start date. But if you go and you read through the District of Innovation that's posted on TEA's website, usually the number one thing that people are putting out now is uncertified teachers. And then they'll go to number 2 is start date, right? And then they'll have 3 or 4 other things that are associated with that. And so District of Innovations allows that to be able to happen. And then you move into the pandemic, and the pandemic happens, and we lose 14% of our workforce in basically 1 year. Teachers retired, they didn't come back into the workforce. So then what does the legislature do? Then it changes their mind and comes back and passes, you know, Senate Bill 202, in the 87th legislature that says, okay, well, you know, we're not going to make the teachers pay for this, for this surcharge anymore because we have a pandemic. So you've got these policies that go into place that create some of these problems associated with that. But House Bill 11 is really important because that was Chairman Dutton's bill. And what Dutton did at that particular time was he recognized that, you know, we have to have a residency program. We have to figure out a way to be able to do this. And part of that came from when he was chairman of public education in the session prior to that, when we started talking about, because one of the last pieces of joint committee they had with higher education during that interim period of time was talking about, you know, what can we do to incentivize colleges, community colleges, grow your own programs, a variety of different things to be able to do that. And so as Charles had pointed out, and certainly Dr. Reinhardt pointed out, you know, we have a problem we kind of created ourselves, right? We haven't focused on it. And so we haven't funded education. We've underfunded education. And if somebody asks a question, you know, and we hear it all the time around, and is that, well, we're underfunding education. Well, how much is it? Well, I know what it is because we can do the inflationary index associated with it, but it's all based on certain parameters associated with it. But there was $4 billion left on the table last legislative session. There was a lot of policy and political fights surrounding vouchers, and that was a big issue. And so we're going to see where that lands this next session. But I think what's important is that it's very clear to us that teacher pay has not stayed up with inflation. The money's not there, and the people are not as engaged through the process. And in particular, what we're seeing is that we've seen the growth of uncertified teachers. So charter schools are at the highest at 60%. There was an article published in the Texas Tribune. 60% of the teachers are uncertified within charter schools because they basically don't have to be certified under their rules and regulations. But statewide, we're at 40% of the workforce that we're talking about. 32% of that is in the public education sector. And if you think about that, the largest school district in the state of Texas, Houston ISD, just had an article talked about it and said 1 in 5 teachers are uncertified right now. They can't get them hired, even though they're paying some of the highest pay that's out there right now. So it is a serious problem, and the legislature needs to look at, you know, either House Bill 11, then, you know, obviously on the flip side, the Senate had Senate Bill 9 that got killed. And it candidly, the frustrating part for me, I was there and I dealt with a lot of these guys, and we were able to get some things done over the years. But the frustrating part is that, can you just act like adults for a little bit and try to get something done? And I have dear friends that are up there, but this is super important. And we, as the education community, say, if you guys want to have your fights about this, but we've got a real problem right now. And we have got to make sure that these teachers are compensated and we get them in the classroom.
Thank you. Well, you all have, I think, really laid the groundwork for some additional context in which this report sits. And in just a minute, I'm going to give you a chance to talk about what you think needs to happen as we give you each a chance to sort of wrap up. But let me just bring Michelle and Charles back in here. What would you add? What would you layer on to what Dan has said as we make meaning of what our researchers have shared with us today? What have you not mentioned that you would like to make sure we add into the conversation?
I'll start. I think one of the things that you're seeing as well is how this shift also fundamentally changes the role of the school district, because in many ways, the role of the school district used to previously be that of the employer and then to support, well-trained teachers to do the work, right, of teaching and learning and to leading teaching and learning. But now schools need to do that and actually be the training site that is taking over, if you will, what used to be done in universities, of actually preparing people to do the work while they are doing the work, right? And so there are so many additional strains that puts on schools specifically to be able to provide that level of supports. A couple of examples of what we've tried in our part of rural West Texas. For example, in the last 3 years, we have hired retired teachers to come back as part-time mentors because our administrative staff on our campuses don't have the bandwidth in terms of time and human capital, if you will, to be training and supporting so many brand new uncertified teachers, right? But that has come at a cost. That has cost us 2 teaching positions across the district that we otherwise would have had in order to bring those services in. And there's no funding from the state for that mentoring specifically. Y'all talked about some of the other challenges specifically around classroom management, right? And some of the challenges that come with having to learn how to do the difficult job of teaching while serving as a first-year teacher. And that just really changes the makeup of what needs to be done within school. Somebody shared in the chat just saying, you know, that has an impact on other teachers as well, who are now taking on an additional burden of supporting colleagues in a way that 10 years ago they didn't have to. And so those are some of kind of the hidden costs behind the scenes of schools having to take on this secondary role of preparing our workforce while also employing them.
Yeah, as Charles is coming in, I'm just going to reflect that I saw this image in my head as you were speaking, Michelle, of being in a field hospital in the field of battle. And you're triaging everyone who's coming in, but now you're actually getting people who need to be trained, but there's no money to train them. So you have to take the surgeons out of the operating room and put them into training the people that are coming to you. So yeah, it's
right. And imagine that half of your surgeons are those people with no training, right? That's where we're getting to, and
it's
like,
like,
how is that sustainable? Yes.
I think the waterfront's been covered. Yeah.
a lot of it's been covered.
I said the waterfront's been covered, I think.
Well, before I ask you then for your final thoughts, Dan, anything else that you would add that stood out to you or that you would really like to underscore in this conversation then?
Yeah, I think it's important. Dr. Torres did a great job, you know, certainly presenting that, but also at the committee, the interim committee hearing that was held, and to talk about this issue. The good news is that Chairman Buckley and I know Chairman Creighton are both very engaged and interested in solving this problem. My hope is that they will do that individually versus in a big ominous bill, because it's critical that we address this problem. And districts like Alpine or Austin ISD, that, you know, which is much larger but has a very similar problem. I mean, think about Austin ISD as an example. I mean, you know, they're trying to do a TRE right now. They're trying to, you know, try to pass bonds. And oh, by the way, you ever tried to live in Austin ISD and how expensive it is? It's crazy. And so you have districts, or Houston for that matter, that just, it's not sustainable anymore. We are not crying about this. We're just stating facts. And so reports like this are unbelievably helpful from the research community, because we're not talking about opinions or anything else. These are facts. It is a fact that we have a epidemic in the teaching community right now. And it's a combination of making sure that we identify those kids, but make it into a career that is revered again, versus being revolted upon. And that's what we're having happen. And the communication and the visceral politics around trying to achieve an objective and a goal is hurting teachers. And we know from stats in your report, look, an uncertified teacher causes a kid to lose 3 to 4 months of learning. That's just a fact. And so let's focus on getting a bill like House Bill 11 or Senate Bill 9 or some combination of those two as a forefront, and using this information in this report and the reports from Texas Tech and others to your advantage. And I think candidly, they listened. The committee listened about this. And I know there's a deep interest by Chairman Buckley. He's very concerned about this. You know, I mean, heck, his wife is a assistant superintendent in Killeen, and so she's interested in trying to solve this problem as well. So I think the spotlight is there, and that's the congratulation that I would give to you, is that, because that's the data points that are, in my opinion.
Thank you for that.
Tara, maybe I missed my opportunity to touch on this, but you had mentioned some of the things, you know, and it can't and won't speak to specific legislation or anything along those lines, but the practices that we have happening in the state right now. Somebody actually addressed it in one of the questions. I actually think that we have pretty significant investments right now, particularly from a philanthropic standpoint. And I think that there is will to do this in a lot of other areas in what really high quality preparation does look like. We see examples of this right now. In fact, we'll have a cohort of educator preparation funders across Texas joining us in Dallas next week. And we'll be looking at the Dallas College model that's utilizing a a paid residency model, which is outstanding because a lot of your high preparation models themselves struggle from a financially sustainable standpoint. The University of Texas, obviously your own institution, is approaching that from a post-bac perspective and trying to open up and create additional supply from a high quality standpoint. So I would want to note that there are some really, really great examples that our state can look at of where this is actually being done well, sustainably, and set up as a strong pipeline of teachers. The issue is scale. And the issue is the will to ensure that that's the standard versus the exception. And I think that we're very unique in that way with a couple of the programs, a few of the programs we have across the state right now.
So remembering that to highlight some of the things that are working, and then the question becomes, how do we fund those? How do we scale those? Share the high quality educator preparation that we know is working. Great. Well, I'll just offer each of you kind of a 1 minute summation, 1 to 2 minutes. What would you like to leave us with in terms of recommendations? If you could have this group of folks on the webinar who care about this issue think together, do together one thing, what would you want to leave us with?
I'll start by saying, appreciate y'all amplifying rural voices on this issue, because I think your data has shown pretty clearly that this issue disproportionately impacts rural districts. I think there's a lot to unpack there about what is driving those differences in rural Texas, and our rural schools make up more than half of our ISDs in the state, while serving about 20% of our student body. I think really kind of some of the next steps are thinking about, why are districts doing this? And Dr. Torres gave a nod to this, that we are being left without a choice. And so what are some of the contexts, particularly happening in rural districts where, most of the bottom 20% of underfunded districts in the state of Texas are rural. So what is contributing to that? What is policy we can move forward to, yes, increase funding across the board to address some of these issues, but really to narrow the gap between the haves and the have-nots in public education funding in Texas? And how does that intersect with this really important issue about being able to provide high quality teachers in every classroom for every Texas child?
Thank you. Charles or Dan?
I'll go next. I'll let Chairman Huberty close us out. He probably has a better perspective than any of us, but it's kind of what I had said before, right? Is we actually know what good preparation looks like right now. We can actually do it. And I would, from our vantage point, again, we're investing and thinking about these things from a catalytic standpoint, but not all the philanthropic dollars in the world can be what needs to be done, in these particular spaces. I also think, and this is a slightly in a line, but a little bit different perspective. It's important for the public and for those that utilize public education as a service, and those that can and be utilizing public education as a service, understand it as such and trust it as such. And a lot of times in this space, we talk about inputs and we talk about outputs, and a lot of times we don't talk about student achievement first and foremost. And I think that that's implied, but I think it's really important to lead with that, because at the end of the day, we're talking, when we think about teacher preparation and we think about our schools, those are inputs, those are outputs that ultimately are to be an outcome of a public value, grounded in public trust. And so I think when we look at things through a lens of student achievement, I think that allows us to ground our conversation in terms that are applicable to the families that are in our schools today.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to share this. The most important asset and resource that we have in Texas is our youth, and it's our responsibility as adults to make sure we invest in a free, fair, and efficient public education system here in the state of Texas. I said public education system in the state of Texas. We have to have a responsibility to fund it. We have 5.3 million children here in the state of Texas that are responsible, that we're counting on to hopefully take care of us in our old age, right? But we have to make sure we educate them. And the only way we do that is with a high quality teacher. And to get a high quality teacher, we need to have high quality instructional programs. And those can be whether it's in the four-year traditional universities, through the community college system, or through the alternate certification program. In each of those instances, they just need to be high quality. And so when we think about this, and Charles made a couple really great points about that, as we think about the philanthropic is there to be a support and to boost. It's not sustainable long term, and the work that they do throughout the state of Texas with groups that are all over the state of Texas can't do it. We need to have something that's sustainable for Dr. Reinhardt to do her job. For example, they need to increase the minimum salary schedule, as an example, which was in House Bill 100 that Ken King carried last session, who represents the rural communities and understands better than anybody. We have to create grow your own scholarship programs. We should think about scholarshiping those students that want to go to four-year universities to be able to do that. Partner with the private parties like A+ or iTeach or some of those other groups that are out there to create those scholarship programs. Create the residential programs that we had in House Bill 11 or Senate Bill 9 to be able to push those forward. But the most important thing that we as educators and people that care about this, if you really want to solve the problem and we want to move this forward, is that we have to increase the funding for public education. It has not been funded. It has not been increased since 2019. That is just a fact. You can spread whatever analogies we want associated with how much money is going in the system, and I've heard it all. The facts are the basic allotment has not increased since 2019. That is a fact. Yet inflation has increased by double digits every single year. Teachers can't afford to stay in the classroom. And these bills that we have, even with the teacher incentive allotments, that they're talking about increasing those and be able to do that, that's important. But Dr. Reinhardt doesn't have the skill set and group and teach schools like her, and even the bigger schools that are in TAMS, like the Texas Associated Mid-Sized Schools, they don't have the resources that the big districts have to be able to apply for these grants and to go through that program. And so there's opportunity for us to be able to do that, to be collaborative. And as we said in 2019, now is the time to fix the system. Now is the time for finance reform. Now is the time to be able to focus on that. But using the data sets that you have and the work that groups like Charles's group does, and taking into consideration all these things. And I can tell you that Chairman Buckley was with us this past weekend at a conference, and we were talking about these things. He is dead serious about fixing this. He is dead serious about moving this ball forward.
Well, I think you've
And
given us our marching orders.
Yeah, right. So anyways, that's a lot of different stuff, but from a priority perspective, if we use our voices effectively and efficiently, can help. And that's what we want to be viewed as being helping. But we have the facts to be able to prove what our case is. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you to all of our panelists. I think you've each brought your own voice and perspective, and you've given us not only a lot of extra things to think about, but I think some wind in the sails for this next leg of our journey. So thank you individually and collectively. And with that, I'm going to invite Dean Martinez to close us out with a few summary thoughts and to share some next steps. Thank you again, panelists. We sure appreciate you.
Thank you, Tara, and so much gratitude to our incredible panelists, Michelle, Charles, and former Chairman Dan Huberty. Such an informative and perspective generating conversation we just had with our panelists. There's a lot of things that stick out to me as themes from the conversation and our panelist review that I just want to underscore. Underneath this conversation seems to be a core issue around maybe two things. One is our valuing of teachers in Texas. And the second thing that Chairman Huberty just perfectly underscored is what's at stake for Texas, that our entire future depends on how we support this next generation of young Texans in this gigantic state. Our economic vitality and the future of this state depends on that. So the stakes couldn't be higher. And yet the first problem around as we think about how we value teachers continues to be a challenge. Underneath this hydraulics of history is a sentiment that doesn't really matter how teachers are prepared. And I think the data continue to show that it does matter. High quality teacher preparation makes a difference. The studies demonstrate this over and over again. The view that we can simply hand someone off the street a dry erase marker and set them in a classroom and expect good things to happen, and a learn by experience alone model puts at risk a whole generation of young people, because remediating challenges and mistakes of teachers who are not prepared is incredibly difficult to do inside the system, which makes the stakes extraordinarily high. And I can't imagine another profession where the stakes are this high, where lives are at stake, in which we would believe that it was reasonable simply to have completely unprepared people learn on the fly. And I think that speaks to this challenge around how we value teachers. So I just want to underscore this moment, because it did come strongly from our panelists, and I'm just maybe naming what's in the room with us, because I think it's just essential that we talk about it. My friend Charles Glover made an important point around what are the characteristics of high quality preparation. And to make progress the way that Chairman Huberty is describing with the legislature, we also need to be able to better define, or at least make it clear, what high quality teacher preparation looks like. What are those characteristics? Because there is capability for Texas to make investments in those programs being innovative, ensuring that they have easier routes to that innovation in terms of compliance from the state, and that we can scale up those programs. What makes them work is really important, and what distinguishes those higher quality programs, that it would include what we do in higher education, high quality alternative certification residencies. There are really strong models, and they're not relegated to one kind of preparation, but distinguishing them from the ones that are more dangerous or uncertified is really important for us to deliver the resources where they need to be. I also want to just highlight this conversation about retention and mentorship. The problem we're facing is become a catastrophe over a period of time, but it is a longstanding problem. And underneath this are, and it was alluded to many times today, the conditions that drive teachers out of the profession. Lack of pay, particularly compression in pay over a career, which Michelle alluded to, is incredibly important, as is frontline pay. But compression in pay is a huge issue that drives teachers out. We all know that it's not generally kids that drive teachers away. It's things that happen in terms of their working experiences, how they encounter those things, and it's increasingly challenging. So unless we deal with that problem, the causes of an exodus, we're never going to solve this with simply adding more bodies to the front line. So I just want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the critical need we have to better support our teachers during those early years when they're beginning, in particular, whatever their certification. There is high quality mentorship programs. There's rigorous approaches to instructional coaching and mentorship. We need to lean into those kinds of opportunities to really make a difference at scale. So I'm very grateful to the panelists. I'm very grateful to our research team for the hard work in shining a light. I also want to acknowledge our researchers, Dr. Michael Martyr, Dr. Laura Torres, and our colleagues who had advised this report, including Dr. Pedro Reyes, Dr. Celeste Alexander, Dr. Beth Malik, and Dr. Allison Scarrett. Thanks also to our terrific marketing communications team for assisting in designing the report. All of you are about to receive in your inboxes, and also producing the webinar today with Tara Kirkland. Dr. Martyr is one of the first on our team who sounded this alarm about the data on uncertified teachers over a year ago now, and your research is really the foundation of beyond the tipping point. And so I want to offer him a quick reflection or observation as we close, and then I'm going to finish up here with just a what's next. So hang on for that. Dr. Martyr.
Thank you, Dean Martinez. Colleges of education in their modern form started at UT Austin in 1891 with the foundation of a school of pedagogy, and you're the descendant of that first school aimed at preparing secondary and administration officials for schools. There's a lot of questions in people's minds. Maybe the main one is, where do we get the quality and where do we get the scale to address this question? And I think there's a really simple answer. Generations of Texans have built public institutions of higher education across the entire state, and virtually every one of them has the capacity to prepare teachers. You didn't hear many calls for more funding for universities here because we have the buildings, we have the staff, we have the expertise, and we even have the students. But what we don't have is enough help from the state that enough students are going into teaching the right way. You want an efficient way to increase the teacher supply at the highest level? Provide us what we need to get the students to go through our existing programs. We can do the job. We can do it well. We can do it at scale. So I'll turn things back over to Charles. I think that we really can provide the state an efficient system of public free schools as the Texas Constitution demands.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marta, for those comments. So what happens now? In addition to sharing this report with all of you, we'll be working over the coming weeks and months to share the report and discuss it with legislators and policymakers across Texas. So we're very excited about that follow-up. And Chairman Hubert, I just want to extend a personal thank you for continuing to keep my optimism high about what Texas can do and what our legislators are committed to beyond the complexity of whatever seems to be in the room at times. This is an urgent call for this session, and I think you described our role perfectly. Our job here is to be rigorous and to provide those decision makers and advocates who care about the data the tools they need to make their case for the things that need to happen in Texas. We do stand ready and willing to partner. When you're interested in us sharing this report in the way that we can, in this sort of objective, neutral, here's what the data tell us, so that the audiences can understand the data and use them to help make their points. I just want all of you to know that that's what we're here to do. It's our responsibility as a public institution to provide that kind of support for Texas.